I am Shumon Basar. I'm one of the curators of Age of You with Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Douglas Coupland, and I'm here at the Jameel Library to talk about a number of books that mean a lot to me in the library. So I want to start with actually I think the first book that I discovered in the library when I visited a couple of years ago, and it was on this shelf back here where the continental philosophy books are, and I was thrilled to discover a number of books that have mattered to me growing up and becoming who I am, but in particular this book, Glas by Jacque Derrida. And I was very surprised to find it here because it's not necessarily Derrida's most important work, but for me it's one of his most interesting. So Glas was published originally in French in 1974, and it then took 12 years to be translated and published by the University of Nebraska Press. And what Glas is about is maybe the least interesting thing about Glas, but it's essentially a kind of dialogue between Derrida's interest in Hegel, but also the autobiographical writings of Jean Genet, the French playwright. But I think when I first discovered this book, which was when I was at Cambridge University in the early 90s, it was at a time when the fervor around post-structuralism and continental philosophy was still at a kind of fever pitch. And Jacques Derrida was essentially a kind of rock star of philosophy. And this book, for me, represented a very curious kind of articulation of Derrida's complex thinking, which he's associated, of course, with deconstruction, with the idea that language is unstable, that language is never kind of fixed, that it's mutable, and that meaning and language and words and sounds are a kind of constellation that are always shifting through time and through space, but also through our bodies and through culture and society. And so when I discovered the English translation of Glas, I guess, and then I opened it up, and for a start it's in this interesting kind of square format, which is unusual. It's neither a novel size nor a paperback. It doesn't have the normal portrait dimensions. And you think, well, that's kind of interesting for a philosophy book. Like, what kind of philosophy book should be square in shape? And then you open it up, and then immediately, when you get to the first page, you realize that it looks like no other philosophy book that you've probably ever seen before. Because what Derrida has done, and in both cases with different graphic designers and typesetters, is he's running a number of concurrent narratives here, concurrent texts. So on the left-hand side, it's this disquisition, this reflection on Hegel, and then on the right, it is these reflections on Genet and Genet's notion of autobiography, but then also running through the center of both of those columns is another narrative, another account, and then inside each of those columns are blocks of quotations and citations, and it produces it's kind of almost like a city plan of texts, but mostly fragments of texts. And I think this is very important to me, this idea that the relationship between a fragment and a whole, and the fact that sometimes, in order to say the most, one needs to use the most economical means. So just because something is very, very short, very, very terse, doesn't mean that it somehow sacrifices like the value of meaning. But I think the other thing that, this is, what this does, I think, is it challenges the reader how to read this, because there's there's no single way of reading it. So, if I look at this page here, do I read from here to here and then here, here, and here? Or do I go from here? Do I go there? And I think, I've picked 3 books today, and they're all impossible to read. So I'm being something of a contrarian. I know these are sessions about reading, but these are all books that can't technically be read in their faithful manner, because what they rely on is actually a form of the form of visual scanning that we do when we read. And reading is something that, of course, is, there's a sequential aspect to reading, right? We move left to right or right to left, depending which language we read, or we move top to bottom. But what we also do, I think, is we scan. We look at a page, and increasingly now screens, as forms of real estate, as frames of space, and that's why you have some people who are very, very good at speed reading, for example. I mean, what they're doing is kinds of pattern recognition, and I think what Glas is a kind of a meta text of patterns, and the thing that it's ultimately, I think what it's what it's really dealing with is the question of autobiography, and how do we write autobiography. And interestingly, Derrida's father passed away when he was writing this book in 1974. And Derrida's biography, of course, is very interesting. He's an Algerian Jew who then managed to break into the most elite echelons of French philosophical society and culture, but for a very long time, because of his background, was made to feel that he was on the outside. And this sense of being on the outside or on the periphery, or one of his famous books is called Margins, is I think a theme that he comes back to again and again. And so it's not just something that he inhabits, it's something that he practices, and it's something that he articulates constantly again and again in relation to the question of power. Who has the right to speak? What language do they possess? Who are the people that possess language, etc., etc. And so, for me, this Glas is a really extraordinary kind of manifesto of all of these things in a book form that cannot be read. And I think I'm very, very interested in the history of bookmaking that has challenged the question what it means to read. Because, again, I mean, we talk about realism, for example, naturalism in literature. And I think that that's a great deception, because both realism and naturalism are artificial forms. They're genres that have been constructed. So they're as constructed as anything else. But such is the nature, I think, of what one might call mainstream culture, that it's now been deployed as though they are the kind of always, to use a Derridian term, an always already there foundation of like cultural articulation. But again, as I say, they are constructs, So I think what Derrida did, and why Derrida has been important to me and for a countless number of people, I think is this idea that you have to question everything. Now, that doesn't mean that one becomes a kind of, QAnon conspiracy theorist or something, but the truth is that there are systems of invested power and agency in all forms of culture that we consume, and in order to fully apprehend that, we have to be able to read the codes. And I think for me, Glas is a touch point in the relationship between form and content. Samuel Beckett, another one of my great heroes, and I could have picked a book by Beckett, said about James Joyce that form is content and content is form. And so again, we have to pay attention to not just what is said, but how it's said, and I think that's a good segue to my next book. Okay. All right, so my next book is from 1967. It is this. The medium is The Massage by Marshall McLuhan. It's often accredited to Marshall McLuhan, but that's erroneous because actually it's a complex form of ownership. It's a complex form of authorship. It's Marshall McLuhan. It's a graphic designer called Quentin Fiore, and it's a third mercurial figure called Jerome Agel, who was a self-styled book producer, a term that he coined after learning the importance of the Beatles producer, George Martin, who was often referred to as the fifth Beatle. And so Jerome Agel decided in the mid-60s that he wanted to bring to the mainstream market some of the most complex thinkers of the time, and people who were narrating and exploring the ways in which the world was changing in these very drastic forms, but particularly by figures who were either in academia or, again, at the kind of periphery of culture. So this book came out in 1967 and went on to become a kind of bestseller, and is considered, I think, one of the touch points of like the countercultural movement in the late 1960s. And a little backstory: Marshall McLuhan was one of the founders of what we could now call media theory. He was a scholar in Elizabethan poetry and pamphletry, and a James Joyce scholar, and from the 1950s onward produced a number of extremely enigmatic, influential but often opaque texts and books. The first one called the Gutenberg Galaxy, about the revolution that happened with the advent of the printing press in the 15th century. And so by 1964, McLuhan published a book called Understanding Media. And in that book, he kind of unleashes what are still considered to be many of the kind of tenets of media theory today. But he also enunciated a term that was one of the first viral terms, I think, of media theory, which is the medium is the message. So this goes back to this idea that form is content and content is form. And so Jerome Agel had been reading Marshall McLuhan, and his brain was kind of exploding at the kind of profound number of insights that McLuhan had been making about what we could call electric media at that time. So television, radio, advertising, magazines, this kind of stuff. And so Agel then went to a graphic designer called Quentin Fiore and said, Quentin, there's this great professor called Marshall McLuhan. what I want to do is make his ideas accessible to a 10-year-old girl. And, do you want to do that with me? And so Fiore said yes. And then together they approached McLuhan. And they basically pitched this idea that, Professor McLuhan, we want to take your ideas and remix them effectively. Of course, that's my term. And he said, sure, why not? And then they went away, and then they came back. And what they came back with was this piece of unprecedented, what I call a paper OS, like a paper operating system. And it's the form of a paperback that's quick fire. It's a kind of quick fire. And what it does is it takes McLuhan's complex ideas, but distills them into this, again, a collage, like a fast-moving collage between image and text. Later on, Fiore described his ambition as producing a dialogue between the computer and the book. And I find this so extraordinary that he had this insight already in the 60s. So if we pick, for example, if we pick this stretch here, we'll get a sense of it. So we can see this double-page spread, a close-up of what looks like maybe a toe, and then it says the wheel is an extension of the foot, right? So we have the tire, and then the book, and this is, I think, one of the most beautiful, iconic pages from this book, because here we have a kind of meta Chris Nolan Inception, like one-to-one echoing of what our hands are doing to the book. So the book is an extension of the eye, clothing, an extension of the skin, electric circuitry, an extension of the central nervous system. Media, by altering the environment, evoke in us unique ratios of sense perceptions. The extension of any one sense alters the way we think and act, the way we perceive the world. When these ratios change, men change. And again, if you just count the number of words there, it's probably less than 60. But it has, I think, in that extreme crystallization of word and image, I think it's made this extraordinarily profound statement. And, this is a book that one can go back to again and again and again and find different things. And this is the book that when Hans-Ulrich, Douglas, and I decided to do our first book, we decided to essentially update this book to the 21st century. Because Marshall McLuhan died in 1980, so he never got to see the internet. But he in many ways anticipated it. He kind of seemed to sense that it was something like the internet was coming. And he describes many of the facets of the internet, but of course he doesn't have the name yet. And he doesn't necessarily have a visualization of the interface yet. But he definitely anticipates the way in which something like the internet will rewire our collective nervous systems. And so our book, The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, which was published in 2015, is our updating of this book. And our Quentin Fiore is a graphic designer called Wayne Daly. And again, it's extremely collaborative. Our images in that book come from 35 different artists, visual artists. Actually, I'll just read a bit here about... So the invention of printing did away with anonymity, fostering ideas of literary fame and the habit of considering intellectual effort as private property. Mechanical multiples of the same text created a reading public. The rising consumer-orientated culture became concerned with labels of authenticity and protection against theft and piracy. The idea of copyright, i.e. the exclusive right to reproduce, publish, and sell the matter and form of a literary artistic work, was born. Xerography, every man's brain picker, heralds the times of instant publishing. Anybody can now become an author and a publisher. Take any books on any subject and custom make your own book by simply Xeroxing a chapter from this one, a chapter from that one. Instant steal. As new technologies come into play, people are less and less convinced of the importance of self-expression. Teamwork succeeds private effort. A ditto device, a ditto device, a ditto device, a ditto device. It's amazing. I mean, this is 1967. Again, I mean, you just replace xerography with any form of your phone even, and that is just as relevant today as it was then. So I think this is the second book that treats the page as a visual space, and I think reflects the idea that thinking is something that happens in space. Thinking is multidimensional, and it's not linear. It happens in a kind of constellated way with fizzes and bangs and collapses and black holes, and it moves vertically and horizontally, and also it zooms in and out. And I think what this book does is, to me anyway, a pretty good approximation of the way that we think and the way that the world presents its thinking to our thinking. And so the last book that I want to talk about, which completes this trilogy, is, and I'm picking this for a very specific reason, because 30 years ago yesterday, on the 15th of March 1991, this book came out, which is Generation X. Tales for an Accelerated Culture by our good friend, colleague, ally, comrade Douglas Coupland. And in terms of content, what this book is about is, the brief that Douglas was toying with at the beginning, and that his publisher was interested in him writing, was this idea that there was a new generation of 20-somethings who had been born in the late 50s or the early 60s at this point, and that they felt utterly different to their preceding generation. And a few years prior to this, a book had come out in the UK called The Sloane Ranger by a very eccentric character called Peter York. And what Peter York did in The Sloane Ranger was a piece of, you could call it a piece of pop culture anthropology to describe this new tribe of affluent, well-heeled, essentially posh West Londoners, and somehow taxonomize their likes, their dislikes, the way that they dressed, how they dated, how they moved through society and they moved through the world. And Doug's publisher, or a publisher, had approached Doug, having seen a postcard that he had written on a friend's fridge, and commissioned him to write a similar non-fiction book around this new emerging generation that didn't have a name. Douglas then got a very good advance for that time in history, and moved to the desert in Palm Spring. Up to this point, Douglas was primarily a person known for his visual acuity. He had studied sculpture at Emily Carr University in Vancouver, and then traveled in the 80s, studied in Milan. He went to Japan, learned the art ancient art of Japanese flower arranging, and worked for a very famous Japanese magazine called Casa Brutus. And so his 1980s were quite eclectic and quite global, but also exposing himself to all these different visual histories from America, Americana, Europe, Memphis group, for example, when he got to Italy, and then Asia and Japan. And then he went to go and write this book, Hold Away, in the desert, as I say, and came out, I believe, 9 months later, which is an interesting symbolic length of time. And what had started out initially as a piece of nonfiction ended up being a new kind of novel. And it's a novel that follows a group of friends who are essentially, they're kind of, they're friends who feel like leftovers from the latest mutation of capitalist culture. And so they're in dead-end jobs, which Douglas ends up terming McJob. They're jobs that don't have any future. They're literally just jobs to get through every day and every week. And these characters, these group of friends, also basically leave the city, and they also move to the desert. And it's a story about storytelling, and it's about the fact that, as Joan Didion famously said, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And so these group of friends are in the desert, and they're there narrating their lives and to each other. But I think this book made Douglas instantly a extremely key figure in the early 90s culture, which of course then involved things like Nirvana and slacker culture. But this term Generation X was coined by Douglas, and I think ever since then has produced an entire, like a multi-billion-dollar industry of tracking and trending generations, and how emerging generations are different to the preceding generations, and then ultimately, let's say, how can consumerism, companies and industry capitalize on that, right? So I think, I mean, the term is a bit of an albatross around Douglas's neck, I think, after 30 years, although he's made peace with it. But as with any term that becomes like a meme, it ends up becoming more about what it isn't than what it is. And so, you know, it by the mid-90s, it just seemed to be used, particularly by mainstream media and television and magazines and, again, companies, to really pretty much mean anything that they wanted it to mean. And so the original meaning kind of fell away. But why I'm picking it out today in relation to the other two books is, again, because of the form of the book, actually. And it's not like any other novel. And again, a bit like Derrida's Glas, you'll see. This is not portrait, it's almost square, which is weird. And this has a lot to do with the pushback from the publisher at the beginning, but I won't go into that detail. But what I want to show you all is how Douglas organizes these pages. Because you have the prose text running, you know, pretty much 2/3 of the page, but then on the left and right margins, you have other texts and images that appear. So there's a glossary that appears, And I think Douglas is one, like Marshall McLuhan, who Douglas is also kind of indebted to and fascinated with. Douglas is one of the great neologism makers, and he understands that every new cultural era, every new cultural moment requires new language, requires new terminology. And so running through this, running through Generation X, are these you could call them new dictionary entries. So here's one: lessness, a philosophy whereby one reconciles oneself with diminishing expectations of material wealth, or status substitution, using an object with intellectual or fashionable cachet to substitute for an object that is merely pricey. Now, you'll also get these kind of graphic slogans. This one says, "You must choose between pain or drudgery." And I've of course spoken to Douglas about the formation of this book, but also his translation from a visual artist to a writer in quite a lot of depth. And there were two visual artists that were very, very important to Douglas becoming a writer. The first is Andy Warhol, and particularly the philosophy of Andy Warhol, which, is this extremely wry, dry, black humor drenched account of like Warhol's universe and how Warhol saw the world, but also the people around him. This kind of like deadpan delivery of very, very serious things, but in an again economical, but ultimately laceratingly funny way. And then the second artist that's really important for Douglas becoming a writer is Jenny Holzer, and of course her famous truisms: protect me from what I want, etc., etc. So what we see here in Generation X, like here we're behaving like insects, that's very much Douglas doing his like riff on Jenny Holzer. And again, what I think, this, a layout like this. I mean, here we have a little diagram of some IKEA furniture. It isn't clear how you read this. You have to make your own decision about how you're going to navigate across the page, across the spread, and I think, for me, what is important about all three of these books is that they are analog books that anticipate digital space and digital print and digital media. And if we think about what a web page looks like today on a newspaper, for example, it's very obvious to us now that we have become accustomed to a kind of visual complexity of content. So on a single web page, you'll have the article, but you'll also have a bunch of ads, you'll have spam, you'll have other hyperlinks that are trying to take you elsewhere. There's a constant sense of distraction from the thing that you're trying to focus on, arguably, which is the text in the middle. And so I think each of these three books are very, very savvy, early warning systems, it seems to me, for the kind of visual literacy that would ultimately dominate our lives. And this is also what we see in the exhibition that we have here at the Jameel now called Age of You, which is a preview of our next book called The Extreme Self, by myself, Douglas Coupland, Hans-Ulrich Obrist, with Daly and Lyon. And, we're very much continuing this tradition of relating text and image and creating a kind of combustive third, which here in 2021, for most people just look like memes, you know. And so I think all of these books are also anticipate, or they're precursors to meme culture, and but what we could maybe call mimetic thinking, right? Mimetic thinking is a form of thinking, again, that's about like highly compressed information into very, very, like you could say, a very, very tight visual and literary composition. But it also works through virality, right? So, I mean, how are memes measured? They're measured through their shareability, through their popularity, and through the fact that they are then adapted by other people, right? So there's a participatory aspect to mimetic thinking and to memes. And I think, and this is the last thing I'll say about my selection today, I think all three of these books have that participatory element to them. As I say, there's not one way to consume them, to read them. There's not one right way. You as the reader, you as the consumer of content, are a kind of author. And, you know, this would take us back to something like The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes in 1967-68, similar time as the medium as the massage. But that, you know, the death of the author is also the beginning of the reader, and the beginning of the reader as an author, right? And I think that's what we do today, right? Like, the reading is a form of writing. Reading is a form of authorship, and memes are a form of memes are a output and input where we see that process happening in a sense in real time. And so there you go. Hope you enjoyed my selection today.